Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where we're taking the next step in our more graduated company challenge. In the last two episodes we put a couple of basic, out-of-the-box, mechanised and motorised companies through our challenge. Now we're going to start bringing in companies as they were more likely to be used. So going back to our Americans, we have a mixed company from the Battalion Task Force. This is exactly the same as the mechanised infantry company we took out in the first video, but with one of the rifle platoons replaced by a tank platoon. That gives us a company HQ, two infantry platoons in M113s, a tank platoon and a weapons platoon with an M901 anti-tank section and a medium mortar section. For the tanks, I've decided to go with the M60A1 Rise passive. That's pretty standard in Combat Mission Cold War's 79 to 82 period. When we get round to the Soviets, the plan is to use the T-62, so we have something that's pretty much analogous. How does this change up the company then? Well, most obviously we've lost the platoon of infantry, but gained the ability to put 105mm direct fire out to a couple of kilometres. That's a big deal. Looking at it in terms of our three tasks, we now have the ability to support the break-in from longer range. For clearing the objective, we can now bring a tank up and give problematic enemy positions some direct HE, and when the armoured counterattack rolls up, we've got 5 more mobile anti-tank assets. The flip side of this is that we do need to look after the tanks. M60A1s are not very heavily armoured, so the Defender's 87 ATGMs and RPG-7s will make short work of them if they get the opportunity. Making sure the enemy never gets that opportunity means being careful, using terrain, using smoke, staying out of sight, and making sure plenty of suppressive fire is going down. I could, for example, push the tank platoon into the wood to act as a base of fire for the usual approach and break-in, but being in a wood just makes them hard to spot. And given that they probably will get spotted when they open fire, I need to think about whether they will be able to spot and engage any ATGMs that launch missiles at them, given how the trees will disrupt line of sight. I need to think about how fast they'll be able to disengage through the undergrowth if they need to, and how little actual protection the wood offers compared to a reverse slope that they can play peekaboo over. Having a tank platoon also brings with it the question of how to organise the tanks. I have 5 M60s. Do I want them to operate as a unit, assuming I have the space for some sensible dispersion? Or do I want to dole them out to the rifle platoons for close cooperation? Or do I want to find a middle ground? Like we just covered, the tanks have a role in all 3 of our tasks here, and that means that they can be useful whether they are on their own with the infantry or in depth with the M901s. Of course, the counterpoint to that is because the tanks are mobile, they can chop and change. We don't have to pick one option and stick to it to the end. That said, I do think I want to parcel out an M60 to each rifle platoon. That leaves me 3 to still throw around, which is a whole platoon's worth for some forces. I definitely want to use them to add fire to the break-in, but I don't want to go in the wood. I think it's a bit of a trap for tanks, especially tanks like the M60, which are so tall. The turret might be blinded by the lower tree branches, while some plucky enemy anti-tank gunner can see the hull perfectly well. There is a little bit of a reverse slope on the right of the wood. The M901s were using it in the first run to engage the counterattack. From there, the M60s will be in defilade for most of the farm, but still able to shoot up the side of Alpha that I'll be attacking. Combined with some smoke from the mortars and the usual transit onto the right, I think that's going to translate into an effective break-in. From there, we'll see how it goes, but I think hitting one objective and mortaring the hell out of the other is probably a good option. Something I had forgotten about until actually starting the mission was that the M60s carry smoke shells. I was originally going to have to wait until the company FO got into position on the far side of the woods and sorted out a smoke mission to obscure the crossing on the right. Using the tanks to put some fire down is infinitely faster. Both my rifle platoons, accompanied by 1 tank each, are across the gap after only 4 minutes. From there, with supporting fire from a couple of M60s back by the wood and the 81mm mortars suppressing Bravo, 1st platoon moves up, engages the outside of Alpha, and injects a couple of squads into A1 and A2. There is no resistance. Turns out Alpha is completely clear in this run. After about 5 minutes, the rest of the platoon has come up, along with their attached M60, and I'm consolidating on the objective. Things haven't gone entirely smoothly. With the tanks and infantry focused on the right, I deployed my two M901s on the left, setting them up on the reverse slope to cover that flank with the wood masking them from the farm. Unfortunately, I was a little too optimistic about the defilade effect of the edge of the wood, and one of the M901s gets taken out by an AT-7. The worst part is that I didn't even notice until several turns after it happened when I gave the whole map a quick look. The silver lining is that that's confirmed an AT-7 on the far left of the farm complex. It could only have been fired from B13, maybe from B12. Obviously that means that I want to avoid going that way, and with the break-in battle being something of a flop thanks to the fact that Alpha was completely undefended, I decide to tackle Charlie and stage a secondary break-in. It'll also make for an interesting comparison with the Soviet experience in the last episode, so 2nd Platoon and their M60 leave the valley on the right and start to head out to flank Charlie. In the meantime, the Alpha-facing edge of Charlie looks pretty clear. Right up until I send the team outside, a PKM and some infantry open up from buildings C4 and C5. As the firefight escalates and more 1st Platoon's dismounts get stuck in, another two enemy teams engage from B11, firing across the centre. 1st Platoon takes a couple of casualties, but they've got the firepower to quickly gain the upper hand. That fixes the enemy and keeps them suppressed. If this was the same setup as the first American run, I'd have to work out how I was going to close with them and clear the buildings. This time, I can cut that tactical corner and just blow them up with 105 heat shells. 1st Platoon's M60 puts some rounds into the Charlie buildings, then pulls back and comes through Alpha to give B11 the same treatment as 2nd Platoon comes up on the right and takes over the Charlie angle. With the mortars now adjusted onto the back of Charlie, courtesy of line of sight through the centre of the farm, I can get stuck in. Some M60 smoke fired directly onto the Charlie corner gives the M113s the obscuration they need to safely close the distance, but I still decide to kick the dismounts out early. This is mostly because I've not got a lot of targets in Charlie. Obviously I'm a little paranoid about certain positions after the BTR company run, but I've got nothing concrete to go on, and although I have more vehicles, more dismounts and a tank, I still want to know what I'm getting into. So a couple of squads get out to try and provoke the enemy into opening fire and revealing their positions. Ironically, it's actually the gunner of 2-1's M113 who attracts attention. Some fire comes his way from C8 in the middle of the Charlie blocks. He sends a burst from the 50 back, but gets domed and the M113 verses off. On the next turn, the enemy in C8 hit one of the dismounts, and another one looks to go down from fire coming from the Charlie corner. C8 gets a storm of return fire, including some 105mm shells. The corner is a completely different prospect because it's still pretty well smoked up, so I send 2-2 in to assault it almost directly from their vehicle. I'm confident C12 is clear, I've been shooting at it and it's not shooting back, so 2-2 gives C14 a quick burst and then storms inside with orders to keep shooting into C15. Then everything goes wrong. There's an enemy team waiting for them in C15, and they immediately open up to the point of firing an RPG at them, which I have to admit is pretty ballsy. The reality is that C15 is totally unsuppressed, and while 2-2 had orders to unload into that building as they occupied C14, the way combat mission works here is that they will complete their move, then open fire. I ordered the entire squad in, which meant that it would take much longer for them to all finish the movement order, so they never got the chance to shoot. It might have gone better if I had split off a smaller team, but I didn't, and 2-2 gets absolutely shredded. I can't sort this out from where I am. Trying to put some suppressive fire up the narrow angle between C12 and C14 is a non-starter, but I have got a problem solver up my sleeve. A couple of turns earlier I was getting a little bit cagey about only having a single tank supporting my attack on Charlie, so I sent another one up from the rear. This is just arriving as I discover a sudden urge to delete C15, and I bring it round on the far side of the farm to get the job done. The M60 gets a couple of shots in, setting the stage for the infantry to exploit, then something hits it in the turret. Somehow, it's not a penetrating hit and there are no casualties. Equally lucky, the crew spot the AT-17 that just engaged them from building 13 up ahead, and quickly delete them. With infantry teams moving into C12 and C14, capitalising on the M60's contribution and killing the enemy that almost wiped 2-2, I pull the tank back a bit. Luckily, only the 50 in the commander's cupola is out of action, and although I very quickly solved my problem on the Charlie corner, I have to admit I was probably going a little too fast. I just lost a sixth of my rifle squads and almost lost a fifth of my M60s. We're only 20 minutes in, it's not like I need to rush. That said, break-in achieved, I can afford to slow down a bit. 2-3 clears up the corner buildings, polishing off the enemy platoon HQ in C16, securing the flank of 2-1 so they can come up and take C6 and clear the middle Charlie block. With 2-2 out of action, that's about the limit of what I can achieve with 2nd Platoon, so I bring 1-3 round from Alpha under smoke cover to enter C2 and clear the closer block. Neither squad encounters any meaningful resistance. All the outgoing fire has done its job. With the blocks secure and a squad at the Bravo end of each, I can start plotting my next move. Sending a team out into C1 draws no fire, so it looks like the enemy threat to this avenue of approach was neutralised when the two teams in B11 went down. Moving 2-3 up to C10 and C11 likewise draws no reaction. It's only when I pop a team out to the hedge line outside C5 that I get a spot. There's some enemy in B12. This contact quickly resolves into the other 87 team and they go down under a hail of fire. With no other sign of the enemy in Bravo, I start working half of 2-3 up to check the buildings when 2nd Platoon HQ gets a contact icon to their front. The combat reconnaissance patrol has turned up. I've already been conscious of that possibility, so all the M113s are tucked into cover and I have a somewhat impromptu anti-tank screen up. The half of 2-3 that stayed behind has a dragon, and while 2-2 is out of action, the platoon commander himself has picked up theirs. Plus, of course, I have 3 M60s in the farm. The 2 tagging along with 2nd Platoon are in position to quickly reorient to the north. The 3rd is back in the triangle where I can send it left or right as necessary. For now, the enemy is out of sight to the other 2 tanks and the surviving M901 in the rear thanks to the slope. As it happens, the enemy decides to go left. 2-3 get a dragon into the side of the T-72, knocking it out. Then 2nd Platoon's lieutenant nails the BRM. There's a little interlude as the other half of 2-3 checking on the dead AT-7 team comes under fire from B8, but by now I've sent 1-3 across into Bravo and they're able to nip that threat in the bud. In the final turn, one of the M60s takes out the first BMP, then the second one goes down to a 1-2 punch from 2-3's dragon and the other tank. With that, the enemy surrenders. All in all, I've taken 18 casualties this time, plus the M901, which registers as a tank for some reason. If we consider that 8 of those casualties were from 2-2, which was almost wiped out in a single incident, and another 3 were from the M901, then we can chalk up a good 11 of those losses to me being careless. The defenders, on the other hand, are almost entirely out of action. They've sustained 55 casualties, including all their vehicles, and only have 2 men still kicking, 2 bailed out gunners from the CRP. My initial takeaway here is that this run was by far the fastest and smoothest of any of the complete challenges so far. The ability of the M60s here to delete or smoke up enemy positions was a total game changer, and I only really used 3 of the 5. We'll get to that though. Let's break everything down first. Actually getting to the objective and establish a foothold was pretty trivial this time because Alpha was not only completely empty, but as it turned out both enemy ATGMs and their FO team were on the other side of the farm. Combined with all the RPG teams being further back and in defilade, there was literally no threat to 1st Platoon as they came in. That does feel like a bit of a shame because I shot the snot out of Alpha with the M60s. Their ability to put down smoke was on display though, and that's really our first indicator of the tanks acting as a tactical lubricant. Smoking up the gap between the deployment zone and the valley on the right was trivial. The M60s just had to fire some smoke shells. Having direct fire smoke on demand is a fantastic ability, especially given that it can be deployed out to a considerable distance. This was really useful in 2nd Platoon's attack on Charlie, which is mostly what we're going to be looking at for the break-in because, you know, it really was a kind of secondary break-in and this time there was actually some opposition. Attacking Charlie, I uncovered 3 problematic defensive positions. The enemy in C8, which I pasted with an M60, the enemy in C14, which got the better of me until I was able to paste them with an M60, and finally the AT7 in B13, which did get its hit in, but then I pasted it with an M60. The big issue the motor rifles had was that they didn't have the firepower to suppress or destroy the enemy, meaning that they had to fight their way forward and take a lot of risks. The combination of smoke and high explosive offered by the tanks here turned that around completely. Yes, I lost an entire squad, but that was on me. 2-2 got wiped out because of bad drills, not because the TOE was flawed or even because of bad tactical decisions at my end. I fumbled the clearing of a building. I put too many men into a position where they were exposed to an unsuppressed opponent. Mistakes were made. The speed with which that enemy team was subsequently taken out, literally the time it took to hit them with 105mm heat and mop them up with the dismounts, should illustrate that that was a bit of an aberration. Naturally, the Charlie break-in merges into clearing the objective, and, I guess we pretty much covered it, the old infantry find, fix, flank, finish became a lot more like find, fix, destroy, pick up the pieces. There was much less of a need to maintain fire superiority for extended periods while infantry teams manoeuvred onto enemy positions to clear them. Finding the enemy was half the battle because once they'd been located, it was easy enough to bring a tank up and remove them. There are, however, some important caveats. Firstly, the enemy anti-tank threat in this particular run was anemic. The 2 AT7s were way out of position, though we could argue whether I exploited that after the M901 got hit, and the 3 RPG-7s in the Soviet platoon were all scurried away with poor fields of fire. There was one in C15, which was literally on the far side of the objective, and the other 2 were both in C8 due to a quirk in the random deployment. That's not necessarily a bad anti-tank position. It's got some keyhole defilade going for it, but I didn't notice them getting an RPG off, and it would obviously have been smarter to spread the anti-tank weapons around more. Come to think of it, the only RPG I saw the enemy fire was the one that 2-2 copped at point-blank range. This doesn't mean that tanks can't perform as a fantastic tactical lubricant, just that I got very lucky here, and that they might not always have this kind of room to work in. Speaking of room, I very consciously didn't want to commit all of my tanks to clearing the farm. I felt the need to bring another one up to help 2nd Platoon, and that did some sterling work, but I also wanted to keep a minimum of 2 back to retain some flexibility and to avoid overcrowding the farm complex. In a similar vein, having 1 fewer rifle platoon made congestion much less of an issue, essentially taking 4 vehicles and 8 infantry teams out of the equation. The M60s didn't only make up for the loss of firepower but brought their own capabilities to the party, and undoubtedly made the formation more effective, but that did come at the cost of having fewer bodies. Obviously it's always a blow losing a whole squad, but losing 1 out of 9 is much less of a big deal than losing 1 out of 6. When 2-2 went out of action, I was left with 2 squads on Charlie and 3 back on Alpha. 1st Platoon was hanging around on Alpha to cover Bravo and offer some Dragon-based anti-tank capability, not specifically acting as a reserve, so chopping a squad to 2nd Platoon to help clear Charlie was not necessarily what I had intended to do. It certainly restricted my options as to how I was going to tackle Bravo. I was committed to attacking through Charlie and didn't think I had the strength to try and get into Bravo from another angle. In this run that worked out, but this was a good run. Finally, with regards to clearing, the 81mm mortars were firing HE pretty much all the way through the battle. They started off with a light mission on Bravo to suppress any potential ATGMs that could cover the approach to Alpha, then I cut them down to a harassing mission hitting the back of Charlie, and steadily adjusted that further and further onto and then through Bravo. They still had ammo left at the end, including all of their smoke, which I didn't use because it was so much easier to use the M60s. They ultimately accounted for 4 enemy casualties, which isn't bad given that they were all in buildings, but at the same time, there weren't necessarily that many enemy troops under the areas I was hitting. That leaves us with the enemy counterattack, and like the first 2 runs, it was the easiest part of the scenario to deal with. I was in position with ATGMs and tanks to completely wipe the enemy out. They never even got a shot off. All I had to do was make sure I had 80 assets in position. Unlike the first US run, the M901s didn't get a look in, Dragon got 3 of the 4 targets, the last one was accounted for by an M60. Despite that, I had a lot of confidence in the M60s. I had 2 ready to engage and got them into defilade, with another one as a kind of close reserve and 2 more able to contribute from death if necessary, along with the surviving M901. So almost as usual now, we have a mix of weapons with different but overlapping engagement envelopes, all of which I can bring forward with my lead elements to maintain an anti-tank bubble. If anything, this is strike 3 for the counterattack's existence as a kind of anti-tank tick box. Here are 4 armoured targets, have fun, instead of them acting as any kind of threat. After we run the forward security element through this to maintain the continuity, I think it might be worth beefing this final task up and making it more of an issue. But for all that, very impressed with the mixed US company here. Adding the tanks is a total game changer, my mistakes notwithstanding. This just straight up outperformed the basic M113 company. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but I did find the difference it made a lot bigger than I was expecting. So it's going to be super interesting to bring out the Soviet forward security element. Not necessarily in comparison with the BTR only company, because let's be honest, it's not going to be difficult to improve on that, but in comparison to this company. The FSC not only doesn't exchange any infantry for its tanks like the US one does, but it should on paper have 120mm mortar and 122mm howitzers in support, which would jazz things up a bit. I definitely think there's going to be a lot less farm left when we're done. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it interesting. If you'd like to watch these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.